Well, hello and welcome to the latest edition of Election Watch, a series brought to you by the Perth US-Asia Centre and United States Studies Centre, reviewing the latest in US politics with a focus on the upcoming US election, now just over 8 weeks away. And it's Labor Day weekend, the final reset before the 2020 campaign in this really crazy year gets underway in earnest. I'm Zoe Daniel, former ABC US Bureau Chief, and it's great to be here. Before I introduce our panel today, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country which you're on and pay respects to their elders, past, present and future. Our special guest this month is Mark Textor, co-founder and non-executive director of CT Group. He has been the pollster and electoral strategist behind the election victories for 7 Commonwealth Prime Ministers over scores of elections, described by Channel 4 in the UK as one of the most influential political strategists and pollsters to walk the planet. And in Australia as a genius at transforming the raw research into compelling communication. Former London Mayor and now Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who sought Texas Council on 2 successful campaigns, confirmed this view, describing him as the sorcerer of numbers. Also on our expert panel today, Professor Simon Jackman, CEO of the US Studies Centre, former Professor of Political Science and Statistics at Stanford, and Professor Gordon Flake, founding CEO of the Perth US-Asia Centre, previously of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, the Program on Conflict Resolution at the Atlantic Council of the US, and the Korea Economic Institute of America. Welcome to you all, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Delighted to be here.
Mark, let's start with polls, which of course we know were way off target in 2016. We have seen some movement in the last few weeks with the Biden lead appearing to peak in July, Donald Trump making up some ground from a convention bounce, and now the suggestion that bounce may have been short-lived. How do you read that roller coaster 8 weeks out?
Well, it has been a roller coaster, and you know, before we start, there's a couple of caveats that we know from previous US Study Centre's seminars on this subject, in that there's so many different things about this election. If I were doing my job in the United States, I'd be very worried about my predictive capacity. You've got ballot turnout, you've got high partisanship, you've got concerns about, you know, health impacts of turnout. You've got some very strange divisions within turnout. And for example, one of the things we know from the Pew research into inaccuracies at the last election is that college education is a big determinant of turnout and therefore of accuracy in polls, and lower, less than college educated, I think Simon Jackman, correct me if I'm wrong, but less than college educated people last time were under enumerated in the polls, particularly in the swing states. And on the latest data we have from associates that were presented to my team yesterday from our associates in the US, we're finding massive differentials on potential turnout and partisanship by college education, and particularly with women. So it seems to be, everyone's talking about a civil war in the United States. Bit fanciful, but it's a nice narrative. But we seem to have a civil war now between differential turnout between white, no college education women who, if they turn out, favour heavily Trump, and who are more numerous, and against white college-educated women as opposed to non-college educated women that are heavily in favour of Biden, who, if they turn out, definitely help Biden. So, you know, how accurate are the polls that have been published, particularly in the swing states, remembering that the predictions last time of overall percentage for each presidential candidates were accurate. What they didn't pick is the college vote, electoral college vote. So we have this bizarre demographic divide, which then accentuates particular risk as to accuracy. And as we were talking about earlier, and in previous sessions, we have in the data from our associates very, very low numbers historically, in fact, never been lower, of hard undecideds. That is, the number of people that have no idea about who they're going to vote for between the two presidential candidates is at its lowest ebb. So as our colleagues on the call say, you wouldn't want to be behind because there's not a lot of folk to mine out there apart from the voters on the other side. So you've got to be very persuasive. But at the moment we seem to have, two tribal camps deeply embedded, and that describes every single data point we're seeing in the United States right now. The thing that's most noticeable is a partisan divide, whether it's on COVID and health measures, whether it's on the economy, whether it's on defence measures. It's the partisan divide measurements in terms of our long-term tracking in the United States have never been more stark. And that's the thing that stands out for me.
So given that, if we have a historical low undecided number, people have retreated to their corners, why is no one prepared to call this in the sense of Donald Trump's going to lose? Here we are 8 weeks out. Is it because everyone was so burnt in 2016 that they just don't have the courage to put that on the table?
Well, it's maybe that, but it's also there are so many known unknowns. We don't know what the effect of the postal vote will be. We don't truly know, I think, although there's been some modelling, what the effect of health concerns will be, say, on Democratic voters going out. Republican voters are probably more bolshy about turning up to a voting booth without their mask. All these things really haven't been measured because there's not a precedent for them. And if it were me working for Trump, you'd be saying, God, this is a very hard thing to measure. But the interesting thing for me is at least there's some self-awareness in the United States right now, because on certain metrics we've been having a look at. One is the perception that tribalism, political tribalism, is getting worse in the United States. And regardless of whether you're Democrat or Republican or independent, the only thing of which there's no difference is an agreement that everyone's more tribal. And in fact, since March, on our numbers, there's been a doubling of the number of people that agree that America has become more tribal during COVID. So as a colleague from the US said, COVID is the steroid for political tribalism.
You talked about the Electoral College briefly there. When you're looking at the polls, do you even take much notice or care much about the head-to-head polling, given that last time it was largely irrelevant? Or are you looking at just those tight state polls?
Well, as a campaign pollster, as opposed to a observer, let's take the Australian situation. Really, you're not much interested in national polls. You are insofar as they generate national stories, affect donors, affect the morale of your troops and backbenchers, and you don't want it to split. But really what you're looking at is the swing marginal seats that will determine the makeup of Parliament. The equivalent of that is the swing states, particularly winner take all, that would make up the Electoral College, and they are two different things. So particularly with winner take all, a small percentage difference can make a massive difference in the result of the Electoral College numbers, and therefore a small margin of error in a very important Electoral College state or a swing state can have enormous influence on the predictive capacity of your polling. So all eyes with the pros are going to be on the swing states and the accuracy of swing states. They're not going to waste a lot of money on national polls. They're going to be going straight to swing states, and they're going to be doing massive samples in the swing states, as well as building those databases in the swing states as well.
Simon, you picked the fact that Biden was tapering back in July. How did you read Trump's slight post-convention bounce, and now what 538 and others are describing as perhaps a quite a rapid tapering off of that?
Yeah, look, I never thought it was going to stay an 8, 9, 10-point race. That's historically way out there on the edge of what we've seen, you know, in 20th century history of US elections. So the idea this is going to be that lopsided all the way to November, but I don't think it was ever on the cards. You know, Trump was going to make up ground. He had a pretty good convention. And I think if you were looking at those 4 days through Republican eyes, it did what it was supposed to do. He's behind in the polls. He needed to give his base a big shot in the arm, but his base only gets him so far. And this is the big sort of, I think, structural issue confronting Republicans in a more general sense in the United States, perhaps Donald Trump in particular. He did a good job of unpicking that lock with some very, very efficient, if you will, and narrow wins in 3 or 4 swing states in particular that allowed him to win the Electoral College, but lose the national vote. And I think what you're seeing is sort of, okay, people saw that nice rally, but very quickly in the aftermath, we've got back to sort of it's almost business as usual for Donald Trump.
And so what's your comfort level in regard to a margin? If we build in we really stuffed it up in 2016, kind of nervousness ratio.
You nailed it, Zoe.
What's your 2020 margin of error?
Well, this is work we're doing, and you know, we're releasing a report next week. So we're here at the Study Center, really, you know, putting my poli-sci nerd hat back on for a bit and doing a very deep dive on the state polls from 16. And this is the point, right? How far ahead would you need to see Biden ahead in national polls to say, well, there's no way there could be a mismatch between, I say, a 5-point national margin, and is there a way for Trump to still, you know, take the election despite trailing 5 points nationally? That's hard. That's a hard sort, because there's lots of ways Trump could do it. If you look just straight at the swing state polls, right now they point to a pretty convincing Biden win. The problem is that, you know, you've got to ask yourself a question: has the polling industry corrected all that ailed it in 16? And as you know, as Tech just said, we were talking to Courtney Kennedy from the Pew Institution about this very issue. And she said, maybe not, right? And have you, you know, simple things like, have you got your education weighting right? Simple things like that. And have those state level polls lifted their game? And the answer is some have, some haven't. So the exercise we've been doing, Zoe, is to say, okay, just take the poll error from 16 and overlay that on the state polls we're seeing right now. Where does that land you? And where it lands you is a very, very narrow Biden lead still at this point. And that's why, Zoe, everybody's so gun shy about this. Everybody's looking at, wow, poll after poll saying Biden up by 6, 7, 8 nationally. And you're going, but, right? Yeah. I can't trust the swing state polls. And then Mark's other point finally, Zoe, is that just that other source of uncertainty. Who is going to show up and who is actually going to be able to have their vote counted? And all of that are things that pollsters have no history with, particularly that last piece, this gap between people saying they're going to vote, people actually going to vote, but actually is their vote going to make it into the official statistics that will decide this thing at the end of the day? Pollsters have very little ability to give you guidance on that.
It's crystal ball gazing even now, just 8 weeks out, and having covered the 2016 campaign, I find it very relatable because I kind of don't believe any of it, to be honest. I want to come back to Mark in a second, but Gordon, first to you. Now, we've talked about this sort of immovable base, and Mark talked about this sort of historically low number of undecideds. But what I always wonder about is the people that I like to call the secret Trumpers, the people that we actually don't know about or that aren't showing up in that polling. Do you think they're there? Do they actually exist? Are they a factor?
I think they're there, but I think they're pretty well captured in that approval rating for President Trump right now. You started off the conversation by referring to the polls as a roller coaster. And I kind of was taken aback by that, because it's only a roller coaster if you're looking at it really closely in minute detail. It's really kind of the kiddie coaster at the amusement park, because the thing that most defines opinions about President Trump and the polling for the last year has been its incredible stability. You know, and now within that stability, there's some things where I completely agree with Mark. The tribalism is obviously a factor. I mean, how else do you account for the fact that at the beginning of this year, President Trump's approval rating was around 41%, and today is 43%, despite the fact that you've had this, incredible pandemic, 190,000 deaths, collapse of the economy, massive social unrest, and yet his approval rating goes up 2%, right? There's no other possible explanation for that. But the notion that there exists some kind of mystical Trump voters outside of that, that really made a lot more sense in 2016 when he was an unknown quantity. At this point, I don't think there's a lot of Americans who haven't made up their mind about either Trump or Biden. It seems pretty clear. So for me going into this, I tend to be a little bit more optimistic. We're at 8% right now, approximately, in terms of the gap. The question I think we should be asking is, what would President Trump need to do to close that gap? Yeah. And then the more important question, is he capable of it? And Simon already alluded to this, right? If he stayed on message, and again, whether you agreed or not, the Republican convention was about message. The last week, President Trump has not been on message. And I see little indication over the last 3 years that he's going to stay on message between now and the election. So that's going to be an interesting thing. One area where I furiously agree, however, with both Mark and Simon is that the polls themselves are just an indication of what might happen in a normal year when election proceeded as normally. Right now, the president has the full force of the US government being utilized as a campaign apparatus. So whether it's holding the convention at the White House itself, the suppression of intelligence that suggests that the Trump campaign continues to collude or at least collaborate with the Russians on messaging, being suppressed, not being released. That's something that we really haven't seen before. We certainly didn't see in 2016. Then when you add on to that the uncertainties that Mark and Simon just addressed, the questions of how COVID affects people's turnout, real efforts to suppress the vote, the president's own suggestion this week that his voters should go out and vote twice, vote online and just to test the system. There's a lot of potential for chaos. And I think that's the question. I don't think there's anybody that thinks if this was a fair and free election and it was held today, we would have any ambiguity about the results. But we do have a real concern because we actually just don't know how these factors are going to play when it comes to actual turnout.
And I mean, just to qualify what I said about being a roller coaster, I think for me, it's about timing. Biden sort of being on the up and then tapering just as Trump gets a bounce and then tapers. So the question is, well, now what happens over the next 8 weeks? Much as I absolutely accept your contention that there has been stability. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, there's been stability in Donald Trump's base the entire time that I've been following what he's been doing. Mark, Gordon points to exactly what I was about to ask you, which is, okay, what are the central factors that could change these numbers over the next 8 weeks? Economy up, COVID down seem to be the two keys to that. But what do you see being influential?
Well, I mean, 8 weeks is a long time. I remember before, when we were running David Cameron's campaign in the UK in 2015, we're still behind in the national polls, a long way up. And the first thing, if you're sitting in that campaign headquarters every day and you're getting up at 3:30 a.m. and going to bed at 11, 8 weeks is a hell of a long time. I mean, it's a hell of a long time. I know it doesn't seem that way outside of the campaign, but it is, in real terms, a long time to do a lot of stuff. I think the couple of points. Firstly, from a campaigner's perspective, one of the things that Donald Trump does that has done that was on the package, as it were, was be unconventional. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, so I'll remain neutral on that, but certainly he's unconventional. And yet he hasn't had the forum where he's able to unsettle his opponent. So he clearly did that with Hillary. He unsettled her particularly in the debates. It was despite accusations that he's not the smartest person in the world, he's actually pretty cunning. And those head-to-heads allowed him to demonstrate the difference between an unconventional, non-Washington type and a career politician. Now, up to this point, he just hasn't had the opportunity to do that. So you've had these two set-piece kind of conventions, but putting aside the efficacy of each one, But the real thing for me about both was that they were kind of set pieces. Yes, you know, Trump's was probably a little better than Biden's, but really didn't allow Trump that insurgent quality that he's most capable of to sort of to really go after Biden. And I'm neutral on them professionally, but I think Trump would be better at that and present that and this idea of an insurgent person still taking on Washington, and particularly since his message is, you know, Biden's been there a long time, he's part of the problem, right? And he just hasn't had the capability of doing that. The other thing is that my friends from Heart and Minds, you know, ex-Worthland people that started a new, you know, deeper qualitative research company, were saying that particularly with those swing female audiences, the very interesting thing about Trump is the ones who were most sort of flexible on turnout didn't like him, but were willing to turn out for two reasons. They liked his economic policy, hip pocket, that it's not these great global geopolitical issues. They were very much still hip pocket, you know, kids' education, cost, all those sorts of things. And moreover, on those hip pocket issues, they were anti-Biden, if you're with me. So two things. They didn't like Trump, yes, so that measurement's a bit of a furphy, because they were using him as the device to send a message about their policy priorities. So remember that word, policy? Well, we haven't heard a lot about it. And certainly hip pocket and economic issues are still, you know, to the fore despite COVID. And I think the real challenge for Biden is, given those things, given the style of his campaign and where he's comfortable, and given that he's got to focus on some pretty basic bread and butter issues to get over this, so it's not all about, you know, health and social dislocation, which is more Biden's territory, to get into on his football field instead of Biden's football field, he hasn't had the occasion. Now, maybe because the campaign is starting to compact and compress, and there is more straight head-to-head ideas rather than two lots of set pieces, that might provide him opportunity. But for me, that would be a must. If he doesn't get the opportunity to be that insurgent in government, as it were, and confront Biden, it's very hard to see him changing those numbers.
I'm curious as to your take on how you read the way that COVID plays for Trump. I think the assumption from outside is that everyone automatically assumes that Americans blame him for what's resulted from the virus, aside from the poor handling of it, and that would be an automatic negative for him at the polls. Do you think that's true?
Well, on the tracking that we've got from our associates in the States, the net impact on social order depends on the party. So Republicans are neutral about the impact on social order of COVID and the riots. I'm putting the two together, right? So they're going, okay, whatever. It's certainly a driver for independent and Democrat voters. I would say that it's obviously a net negative, particularly since that his agenda was pretty much one of, you know, tax cuts, getting ahead, economic opportunity, hip pocket issues for working class families. It's an agenda setting problem. So in political management, we really don't sit there and have arguments about winning 5 points. So say on best candidate for handling of COVID, right? And let's assume that I haven't seen the numbers lately, but let's assume Trump is 15 points behind Biden. And let's assume he does really well and knocks off his deficit by a third, right? And goes down to 10 points deficit. Well, that's a waste of time when he should be flipping to an issue like the economy or hip pocket, where he might have a 20-point lead. And so that's what I'm really talking about, is that most of the time, you know, you talk to even, you know, one of our good friends is Jim Messina, you know, and Obama's pollster of note, and, you know, swapping notes with him, different parties, different countries, different hemisphere. But he thinks of it the same way, which is how can we deal with this issue in such a way that we can move on to our strengths. And the real problem with COVID for Trump, in my view, is he really hasn't been able to do that except with his own voters and not the undecideds, and maybe not the people a bit undecided on turnout. That's his real problem, I think.
Yeah, I feel like it's the only time that he's actually lost control of the narrative and the conversation. Every time previously when there's been something going on over here, he's been able to turn the narrative where he wants it to go. This has been difficult, or more difficult, for him to control. What I'm wondering too is that in 2016, clearly a lot of people in the media and elsewhere missed what was going on, perhaps because they didn't get out and talk to actual ordinary people enough to try to read sentiment. I wonder whether there's a risk of that being repeated because COVID has restricted movement so much that it's difficult to actually analyse what's going on outside where you are. And then secondly, from Trump's perspective...
Well, everyone wants to read the tea leaves instead of drinking the damn tea.
Right.
So, go drink the tea if you want to find out about the tea. Don't read the tea leaves. And that's essentially the problem in modern political analysis, is that there's derived products everywhere, right? So I remember, for example, with the issue of Gonski in Australia. Remember the Gonski reforms? We had, weeks and weeks of saturation coverage in the media about Gonski. What it meant, what it meant for the government's agenda at the time, the politics of it, the demographics of it. And yet when we surveyed the electorate, 80% plus didn't know what Gonski was, right? So everyone's going way ahead of the electorate. And what you'll find, particularly in the United States and Australia, what we have in common is the political analysis accelerates way beyond the ability of people to grasp the basics, right? So here we are talking about demographics of the electorate. Is what campaign pollsters do is ask a much more fundamental question, which is, what do they want, right? Do they want tax cuts? Are they worried about how they're going to use their vote? So not who they're voting for today, that's to be determined still. It's 8 weeks away. What these campaign guys will be saying is, what is axial here? If we have to get an extra turnout group, what issues will we turn them out on? And they are pretty fundamental issues. The difficulty is that with all us highbrow lot talking about this other stuff, particularly in social, in media, it's very hard to use a traditional media to talk about that basic stuff to the punters when it's all about tactics. And therefore, that's why they're using Facebook. That's why they're using direct messaging, phone calls, street visits, and all these things. And that's, to your point, the reason I'm saying this is that's what we don't see. We don't see the pamphlets going through the door. We don't hear the messages being delivered on telephones. That is, the elites. Obviously, we do because it's our job. We don't see the interaction at the town halls beyond the speech, and that's what you really got to listen to. It's always very telling to find out, from a call center what's been said. That's really telling because they are the very issue. So, for example, if in Wisconsin right now the swing voter or turnout voter is getting messages about high school education costs or Biden's tax policies or Kamala Harris's attitude to law and order, that's what they're getting in the research. That's what's turning on voters. And we don't get to hear that in all the great detritus of the coverage of the US elections. We don't get that.
I think that's compounded too by the thinning of local and regional media, that you tend to get a lack of detailed policy analysis in regard to this is how this will affect me in my environment. Everything's discussed at a national level. Now, I want to get back to the other guys.
You don't get the old box pops anymore either.
Well, no. Well, I guess you can if you actually get off your backside and go out and ask people. But just before I go back to Simon and Gordon, I wanted to get to one more point about the sort of style of campaign. It strikes me that one restriction for Trump so far has been that, he thrives on these big rallies, these big events. He hasn't been able to do them again because of COVID. Does that level the playing field with Biden to some degree, because he can't get out and actually generate attention, excitement, and use what he has, which is his personality, his image?
Yeah, it's a function of, or part of what I was talking about before, which is, he's unconventional. Whatever you think of the way he's unconventional, and it's pretty hard to be unconventional when you've got sort of TV set pieces and one-on-one interviews with Jonathan Swan. So it's difficult for him because he needs that, not confrontational element, but he does need that direct element, either direct with Biden, in my view, or direct with the people. He does bounce off them, and he's missed that energy. So even though it was a good campaign, I thought both campaign launches just lacked energy and passion. They looked a bit ham-fisted, both of them, compared to what we normally see. And it's because the campaign teams and the convention teams had never done something like that before. So it wasn't polished, and it wasn't even fake polished. It was all very stilted, in my view. And I think the US voters thought so as well.
Gordon, in October 2016, we saw the Access Hollywood tapes exposing Trump's language and behaviour towards women, then the renewed focus on Hillary Clinton's emails just days before the election. So, in terms of October surprises, it was kind of somewhat out of the box. Do you expect, or would it be standard that we would expect to see an October surprise of sorts in that run-up?
Well, there's certainly a concern. Earlier this week, Simon and I had a chance to have a wonderful conversation at a USSC program with John Bolton, and Bolton himself expressed a concern about an October surprise. Those tend to be foreign policy. They tend to be a little bit more wag the dog type scenarios where you gin up something abroad that will kind of bolster your support, foster patriotism. That highlights a particular vulnerability that President Trump has. He, in recent polls, has been shown to be falling behind Joe Biden among military families. And that's just a real shift. And I think you're going to see a lot in the next week, in fact, 2 weeks, probably for the rest of the campaign, precisely about Trump's relationship with the military. And despite the fact that, his treatment of Gold Star families, which previously was sacrosanct back in the 2016 campaign, didn't have much of an impact, over time, there does seem to be some cumulative erosion. There was a remarkable article out just today by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, detailing, President Trump's attitude towards the military. And we're all familiar, again, with the 2016 campaign, President Trump's remarks towards John McCain being a prisoner of war, saying, I like people who weren't captured. But apparently he's gone beyond that, said of war dead in U.S. military cemeteries in Europe, that there were losers and there were suckers, and not able in his very own transactional mindset to understand why people would do these types of things. And my guess is those are areas of weakness where you're going to see not the Biden campaign necessarily, but increasingly the very vocal and very virulent anti-Trump Republicans who are very familiar with all the dark arts that Mark knows very well, and they're applying them with some incredible effect. So the Midas touch, the Lincoln Project, Republican voters against Trump, et cetera. And so that's an element that didn't exist before that is going to be worth watching. As to whether there's an October surprise or not, I think the world at this point, including China and Russia, are actually very wary of that. And at least if you look at Chinese actions recently, proving rather immune to being goaded into actions that might happen. But hey, we still have 61 days left. So an awful lot of time.
It was a really interesting chat with John Bolton, and Simon, I'll come to you on that. One of his suggestions for an October surprise was another meeting with Kim Jong-un. I went to the first two, so, I'm curious to think whether there might be another one or whether that's even possible in this COVID environment. Is that slightly off the wall?
Oh, look, it's Donald Trump, right? So you can't say no to anything. And that's why.
Maybe they could have a Zoom chat.
Yeah. Look, I just don't know that what that buys him at the moment, something like that. Typically the way October surprises work, it would have to be something monumental with North Korea. And why would North Korea give him anything? What concessions would Trump be making in order to get something out of North Korea that would be election moving? It's hard to imagine that deal is possible, but I'm more thinking October surprise. I'm thinking something domestic. That there's some big bit of opposition research on Biden they might be saving a big drop on, and perhaps with an assist from, the way they got an assist from a foreign actor from Russia last time. Is that in the offing? Number one, that's what I'm thinking of as being perhaps more likely this time around. And the other big surprise might be the debates themselves. Mark keeps alluding to this need for Trump to get back to his insurgent self when he's on prompter, as he was at the White House the other night. Despite the amazing production value of the South Lawn, Trump is very stilted when his aides have got him tied to the prompter.
Yes.
He's much more effective in that free-flowing stream of consciousness that I know you've seen multiple times. I've seen him on the stump. It's sort of the most unusual style of political speech making from people like us who kind of have an idea about conventional political communication looks like, but gee, it works with his base. And the media can't take their eyes off it either. You just get clip after clip out of it. And so can he get back to that mode of campaigning? And that's why I just keep coming back to the debates. They're his last turn at bat, I think, to really get the poll bump and a bit of recovery in the polls that he needs to sort of people start to think this is actually really kind of, wow, we're back to game on. And so they're the things I'm looking for, Zoe. And does he bring something to those debates? Is there a drop in the 24, 36 hours before debate one, debate two, that puts Biden back on his heels with some Oppo research? That's the scenario I'm thinking now, because right now we are a bit stuck in a groove. He can't change the narrative, as Mark is suggesting. Fine. What are the issues I'd really like to campaign on? Well, they're A, B, and C over here, but COVID just won't get out of the frame. Yeah. And he's trying the law and order thing, and people kind of aren't really buying it. They look at Biden and just say, he's not an Antifa puppet. That's not really playing. I think that's what the last week of polls is showing us. So I just keep coming back to, is there some sort of narrative changer going to drop out of the debates?
Yeah.
Can I ask Mark on this very particular thing? Because I understand that, and Simon's logic is sound. That may be the last turn at bat. But if you look at President Trump's performance in the last month alone, the Jonathan Swan interview, the Chris Wallace interview, I mean, there are attempts on the part of his campaign to question Biden's mental acuity. But I'm kind of wondering, do you really want him on a debate stand? Are you comfortable with him in that environment? He doesn't seem to be at the same place he was 3 years ago. So Mark, if you were advising the Trump campaign now, would you see the debates as holding more promise or more peril given the president's performance in recent days?
Well, both, but they're I think Simon's right. They're a rare opportunity to get out of the COVID tunnel that he's in, and the way they'd be thinking about it is, okay, we might need that structure, because at least we're guaranteed to be able to talk about tax, and we're guaranteed to be talking about opportunity and red tape and all those things he needs to talk about, which are typical, fodder for the GOP. He just doesn't have the opportunity, as Simon says, because he's been overwhelmed by all these other circumstances. And as my mentor, Richard Worthland, Reagan's pollster, used to say, the one thing the president has at the end of the day is the ability to control the timing and circumstances of events, right? And when you think about what's happened, he's not controlled that because of COVID. So, yes, I agree it presents some peril. The other is the Jonathan Swan view. I think, we're all fancy people and we take out of those things what we want to see. I don't think necessarily voters saw what we saw. However, He does need that opportunity to debate a range of issues, and at least to try and unsettle Biden, who is very structured. I mean, he's a learned politician. He's not going to change. So I think if you both think of both camps, my view is both camps would be asking that very, very good question you've asked. And on the balance of possibilities, probably more a risk to Biden than it is to Trump, although it does present risks. I agree to both.
I think it's interesting what you're saying, Simon, about the fact that, you know, we've seen Donald Trump reading from a teleprompter. And as you said, Mark, we've seen him in these sort of controlled environments, like in interviews that he doesn't particularly enjoy. My feeling, having observed him for a long time on the campaign and after, is that he'd be feeling very frustrated. And previously, when his staff have tried to keep him on a leash, they've managed to do it for minimal periods, and then inevitably there's some sort of explosion, and that may well be which plays well for him, and that may well be the debates. But then again, that's not really his preferred forum necessarily, is it?
But it is something that's not the current set of circumstances, right? So let's call the current set of circumstances what they are. You know, it's a mix of interviews and opportunities and rallies and all, but clearly, as we've all said, there's been flatlining largely. You know, if you look over time, I agree that really hasn't shifted much. So it does need something that hasn't happened yet, and that's the debate. But also would warn all of us, because we go to fancy restaurants and we go on international webinar calls, but our interpretation isn't the same as voters' interpretation. I'll give you a difficult thing to talk about, but I thought was axial. And one of the pollsters for one of the state campaigns, one of the swing state campaigns that I know in the GOP, was doing focus groups in 2006, just after, a day or 2 days after that terrible, unforgivable thing he said about women, and just terrible. And in Australia, you'd probably be locked up for them about those lewd comments. And a really interesting thing happened, because it shows the true schism in most politics around the world, which isn't demographic. It's reflected by demographics, but it's really the schism between the connected, the elites, the knowledgeable, and the getting on with life, I'm not really interested in politics lot. And it was a focus group with working women. So, warehouse workers, front office workers, nurses. And the issue was raised about Donald Trump's comments about women. And the women in these focus groups said, absolutely disgusting, unacceptable, absolutely unacceptable. But the women who are outing him are women with power, and they will succeed and they will embarrass him. But in my workplace and in my hospital and in my school, if that happens to me, I'm powerless. So what you thought was a simple partisan issue had this schism of power versus non-power. And this is what really divides America today is, who's representing me against the elites or not? And going back to the Trump thing, he has an opportunity to talk about that, because COVID's not an elite versus non-elite issue. It affects everybody. Tax is. So I thought that was a really, interesting moment from that campaign, in that the punter's view about what we thought was a lay-down misere, it's all over Red Rover for Donald Trump moment, was interpreted in a completely different way than folk like us do in calls like this.
I think that leads to another question, because certainly I've had several similar conversations with Donald Trump's supporters, and even sort of wavering people on the edge that may or may not support him. But here we are in 2020, heading into an election after he's been in office for 4 years. People who voted for him for those reasons, because he was going to explode the elitism, because he was going to drain the swamp, because he was going to return manufacturing to the flyover states and all those sorts of things. Do do you read that those people feel that they've been validated, that those things have been delivered to them or not?
Well, on some of them, for example, on the track numbers I've seen from our colleagues in the US, certainly on the economy before COVID and expectations of the economy after COVID, well, amongst Republican voters actually improved at longer term. Handling of the health crisis itself is terrible numbers. So I would say that he would have been in a strengthened position on the economy, notwithstanding everything that's happened. On immigration, well, that's a case of, it's highly emotional message. You're not going to be persuaded by rational arguments about whether the war worked or not. You're going to maintain your position. And that positioning on that Republican versus Democrat, from the numbers I've seen, is relatively inelastic in terms of agenda setting. So he's lost the economy. He's reaffirmed the economy. He's still what he says on the packet in terms of unconventional. He's still certainly, even from the reaction of the elites, shaking up Washington. So he's kept that promise in a sort of emotional sense. But on a united America positively driving into the future, which is kind of a thematic promise, that certainly hasn't happened. And that's, to me, the axial moment. The extent to which he's able to demonstrate that they can overcome these differences to drive forward, that's a very difficult thing for him to say when he's bogged down in riots and COVID. So that's why he's got to get on the tax and hip pocket and get those key turnout women voters to say, okay, Biden's going to hurt my hip pocket. He's going to limit my ability of my kids to seek opportunity. All those sorts of things that enable him tactically to focus on his opponent and drop out some of those hard numbers for him, because he's still got, I think on the latest numbers just in front of me, I think Biden's still got about a 6 or 7% soft vote. And, if the Trump campaign can turn that soft vote into, just not turning out, there's still some hope for them in that regard.
Gordon, you had something?
Yeah, I just want to chime in specifically on that, because going back to the question I raised earlier, what would Trump need to do to increase, his support significantly? And is he capable of doing it? So if you look at over the last, 3.5 years, his support rate has been remarkably stable. And so we can talk about whether or not he gets out and let Trump be Trump in a big rally and he does the unconventional, but I don't know that you get any new voters from that type of behavior. Now, one of the things where I furiously agree with Mark is that there is a risk of just having, elite level conversations, of missing what's happening underneath it, everything else. But for me, my primary information feeds are very bifurcated. In Twitter, I tend to select to follow those people whose analysis I respect on both sides of the aisle, but they tend to fall one way. So my Twitter feed is so very different than my Facebook feed. In my Facebook feed, again, 1,000 people who are largely relatives and on the religious side of things. And for them, increasingly Trump's antics are doing nothing. The only thing that's holding them in is abortion, abortion, abortion. So for me, the big issue that's coming up, which is, the potential black swan, is what happens if Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away? Because, Rick Wilson, who's a driver behind 538, not 538, the driver behind the Lincoln Project, talked about the Republican fetishism of the court. So despite everything else we're talking about, all these people who are troubled by these actions are saying, but judges, but abortion, but abortion, but abortion. And the reason I think that issue is so important is because, one, it provides a rationale, but number two, that's the one issue that has the potential to energize the base and drive turnout, right? So if this really is a question of turnout, then issues like that become far more important, I think, than the economy or COVID or other issues which have not proven the ability to kind of shake that out. And then that just becomes a question of a competition between that issue's ability to motivate turnout versus the reaction and organization on the other side's ability to turn out in a very uncertain environment.
I think Donald Trump, if you were to be ticking boxes against his achievements, he would certainly list stacking the courts as something that he's succeeded at. I think having spent roughly 50 minutes talking about Donald Trump, perhaps it's time to start considering the other side, which is, well, okay, can Joe Biden and Kamala Harris then motivate the people that you're talking about to get out and vote, whether it's based on social issues like abortion, whether it's based on a protest vote against Donald Trump or whatever it is? Simon, do you want to have a bite at that before we go to Mark?
Yeah, the latter. You nailed it, right? This idea that the Democrats need to unify their base and you know, I remember the conversation about the VP pick. Oh, it's got to be a pick that really solidifies the base after they tack so far to the center with Biden at the top of the ticket. I thought some of that was overblown because Democrats want one thing, and it's to get rid of Donald Trump. And that's why they went with Biden, the most kind of centrist candidate they can put up there to get that job done. And they know they got to get it done in 3 states that Obama won, but they lost. In Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and pulling, making the ticket, energizing some of their base, who I think, as I said, I think they had. But number 2, getting back some of those centrist voters, and it looks like they're doing that, if you can believe the polls. Now, the thing I keep coming back to is I look at the midterm turnout, Zoe. So turnout in the 2018 midterm was at a century high for midterm elections. We haven't seen turnout like that in a US midterm election since 1912. And as a share of the electorate, non-white voters went to their highest level we've seen since we've started tracking that, not just in a presidential election, but in any election right now. And you say, the comeback is to say, yeah, but Trump wasn't on the ballot and his people stayed home. And indeed, that's what happened to Obama, right? In his midterm losses as well. But we're talking an altogether sort of qualitatively different turnout environment, what we saw in that midterm. And because white people turned out to vote too. You don't get to century high turnout just on the back of a surge in minority turnout. It was game on for, in a way, as I said, I hadn't seen in 100 years. Now, if that sort of happens again, then I think Trump's in real trouble. If it's
Can I just pull you up on that, just on one thing? Like covering the midterms for me was sort of more head exploding than actually covering the 2016 election in some ways, because there are so many state and local issues and particularities of candidates that people are voting on rather than a sort of holistic political ethos. So therefore, can you translate? I mean, obviously there's some of that enthusiasm can translate, but how much does that translate?
I think I think it got played out in different ways, as you know, as Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local, and longtime Speaker of the U.S. House. That's true, right? In those but there was this unifying factor, and that was we've got to take back at least one institution. For Democrats, we in that sense, being Democrats, have to take back one institution, and the House, right? And so, you know, there's no mistaking it. Trump was what that election was about. The way it may have played out on the ground, Zoe, and in a governor's race in one state, in the southwestern United States versus a Senate race in the Northeast. Of course, they're going to be very different in terms of the issues and the things that get emphasized. But that was a referendum on Trump, as pretty much all midterms are increasingly a chance for the electorate to, if there's buyer's regret, that's when you start to see it. And again, just that explosion in turnout, you go, boy, if that's what's in store, you know, if a little bit of that translates into the general in 20, then remember how narrowly Trump won in 77,000 votes across 3 states, burned into the back of my eyelids. 0.08% of the electorate is how narrow those wins were. And, you know, a few Bernie Sanders voters stayed home on the margin, and Trump did this amazing job of getting people off the couch who typically don't vote, at least aren't reliable voters. But once the Dems say, wow, we can't afford to sit it out, and there's no Bernie's not the candidate, so I'm going to sit it out. No Democrat is doing that. They didn't do it in 18, and I don't think they're going to do it in 2020. And so That's my sense about what's really driving, and what I think is going to be, on paper at least, theoretically, ex-ante expectations are of enormous turnout. And as we talked about very early in the call, I think the real interesting thing is how much of that translates into the official statistics that get certified and send people to the Electoral College to actually decide the thing on January 2 or 3, when the election results are finally certified by the Electoral College. That's the big unknown. But right now, there's just tremendous energy to get out and vote on both sides.
So, Mark, coming back to you, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but does that mean that Biden is kind of a placeholder in a way? The least worse, the least offensive, just kind of someone people can tolerate if they're going to come out and vote anyway against Donald Trump? Well, it's bizarre
because you could argue that they both are. Trump is just the village needed to be burnt, so he happened to be the torch, so he's a placeholder, he's a proxy. And you could argue on the basis of what Simon just said that, that Biden's the same, that he's good enough to get rid of Trump. And that's an extraordinarily bad thing for democracy. But here's what I'm most worried about on behalf of my American friends. If it's not a clear result, in a way, it could be the least legitimate presidency ever, regardless of what happens. If Biden wins narrowly, even if he wins fairly, there will be accusations and a little bit of civil unrest about his legitimacy going forward. There was decency when George Bush Jr. won. The Democrats did a very, very decent thing and decided not to, they contested the hanging chads heavily. But once it was declared, I've got to say credit to the Democrats at the time. They didn't do that. They didn't go there, but Trump will, and certainly a lot of very, very disappointed anti-Trumpers on the Democrat side will. I'm most worried about the legitimacy of this election and therefore the government afterwards, because if you think there is a partisan divide now, imagine disputed ballots, disputed postal votes afterwards. That's a very scary scenario for all of us who love the United States for what it is.
Can I chime in on that, Zoe? Yesterday in the Washington Post, there was a piece by Rosa Brooks, an organization called the Transition Integrity Project. And they actually did wargaming on the US presidential election, which is something I never thought I would hear about. And their conclusion was, out of 7 different scenarios, the only one that did not result in violence and a constitutional crisis was an overwhelming Biden victory. And there's a lot of scenarios where increasingly people are concerned with the mail-in ballot, the difficulty in counting, that is pretty likely now, absent a massive swing, that we're not going to have a clear result on election night. And that just opens the door for a lot of uncertainty and instability, particularly in an environment where uncertainty and instability have been the primary tool of at least one of the parties pushing this.
And just 15 seconds from me, Zoe, on this one. This is not just a spectator sport for an Australian audience. This is where Australian national interests start to become impacted. Who benefits from a deeply contested American post-election environment where fundamental questions about the legitimacy of the government are there? They are not America's friends.
Correct.
It is very much in their interest that that be the case. And for a close ally of the United States, and any close ally of the United States, I know governments all around the world are starting to get their departments of foreign affairs or whatever they are to start, what are those scenarios look like? Who are we engaging with? What is the ability of that government to come together and deliver on the strategic aspirations that I think both sides of American politics agree with, that the United States is in an era of great power rivalry with China, for instance, that we need whole of government approaches. If hanging over the next government in the United States are these deep questions about its legitimacy, how does it present itself to the world? How does it rally its own people and the people in the government to do the heavy lifting that both sides of American politics, they agree on this, there's a big heavy lift needed to rise to the China challenge. And I think that's where there is a foreign policy, there is an Australian national interest implication from this talk about who's going to do what on election night or in the immediate aftermath.
That's right.
And
if COVID is steroid for division, a disputed election is methamphetamine for division. I mean, it's crazy stuff, and it's very, very scary. And I know that pollsters on both sides that I know in the States are worried about it.
And it's 2020, so anything could happen. Lots to ponder on your Labor Day weekend. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Our special guest has been Mark Textor, co-founder and non-executive director of CT Group, and also on our expert panel today, Professor Simon Jackman, chief executive of the US Studies Centre in Sydney, and Professor Gordon Flake, founding CEO of the Perth US-Asia Centre. And Simon, I'll hand over to you to close.
Well, thank you, Zoe, and for keeping 3 loudmouths at the time today. Very much appreciate it. And Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Mark doesn't do this very often. I'm so pleased he's giving the US Studies Centre a little bit of his time, occasionally doing in-house stuff for us with our students, which was remarkable last year, and this public event today. Terrific, Mark, to have you along. And Janine, are we going to tease what's coming up, Janine? We've got the coming up soon. Yes, well, look, in this series that we're doing in partnership with the Perth Centre, Gordon and I will be talking to, and Gordon, your cousin, former Senator Jeff Flake, who we had the great pleasure of hosting here in Australia. Oh my, it seems so long ago, doesn't it, in January.
14 years ago in January. Yeah.
I know. But Jeff Flake will be our guest in our next monthly check-in, and boy, oh boy, we'll just be a month from the election next Friday. Friday, the 2nd of October. That'll be 1 o'clock here on the East Coast and 11 out on the West Coast. So look forward to that one. Again, thanks, Zoe.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure to be in your most capable and professional hands. Much better, frankly, than me trying to keep Mark and Gordon on track. And thanks again to Mark, and thanks to everybody for joining us. Please check the events part of our website. There's plenty more coming up between now and the US election. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.